Thank you both so much for being here. It's our pleasure to have both Stephen and Katie, and Katie especially at this moment. Katie has been a longtime friend of the Pritchard Committee and a longtime advocate for children, for students, and for public education. And Katie will soon be retiring from her post at the Education Trust. So we feel especially gifted with her presence today. And I know many of our founding and original members know Katie well, and they've been excited to know that she was on her way to Kentucky. And there are a few members who unfortunately were unable to be with us today, but they will be waiting with bated breath for the videotape of this conversation so they can see Katie in Kentucky. So thank you both.
No, it's a gift to me. I've been a long time fan of the Pritchard Committee. It's a resource that no other state has. So it's actually a gift to me to be here, not the opposite.
Thank you. Thank you.
All of me to actually be on stage with her.
Right.
She doesn't know this, but when I joined the Georgia Department of Education, the first conference they sent me to was an Ed Trust.
And he's never recovered.
I've never recovered completely, but it was wonderful.
No.
So.
Great, that's great. All of our new members, we try to provide an orientation, and in that orientation we show about a 10-minute little documentary, and Katie is the opening voice in that documentary, so everyone gets oriented to the committee's work through Katie's eyes initially. So without further ado, I would like to provide just a little bit of background on Katie and Stephen before we get into questions. You do have their biographies in your packet, but I still wanted to formally introduce them to all of you. So Katie Haycock is one of the nation's leading advocates in the field of education. She currently serves as the CEO of the Education Trust, which was established in 1996. Ed Trust works for the high academic achievement of all students at all levels, pre-kindergarten through college. The organization's goal is to close the gaps in opportunity and achievement that consign far too many low-income students and students of color to lives on the margins of the American mainstream. Before coming to the Education Trust, Katie served as Executive Vice President of the Children's Defense Fund, the nation's largest advocacy organization. And by way of a personal note, I know Katie is a whitewater kayaker, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she tells interesting tales, and we might have the pleasure of hearing one today about flipping the kayak back over and lessons learned from that event for advocacy, or not. Dr. Stephen Pruitt, who we have the great pleasure of having with us today, and the great pleasure of having with us last year at our annual meeting when he was brand new to the state of Kentucky.
I'm on day 364.
Day 300, and you're on day 364
Tomorrow's
today.
my anniversary.
Tomorrow, okay, we didn't know that. So where is the sweet tea? That's
Y'all
what we
didn't
need,
have any
is a
sweet
little
tea
bit of
today.
sweet tea.
That was a problem. I had
So-
to drink a Coke.
Stephen was fond of saying when he came to Kentucky that he was happy to be finally once again below the sweet tea line. So I noticed
That's the real divider between North and South.
So I actually noticed in his office the other day, there's a nice jug that someone has given you that says sweet tea
That's
on
right.
it. And it's quite a mighty drink there.
It is.
Okay, so watch that
Being a chemist, there's
you
nothing
don't
like a
get
supersaturated solution.
super saturated solution. All right.
And what, you know, the jug in my office is not sweet tea.
After a few years, I might drink your jug.
It'll be less than a few years, Steve.
That's probably true.
Okay, so by way of formal introduction then, Stephen Pruitt joined us here in Kentucky in September 2015. The Kentucky Board of Education unanimously voted to hire Dr. Pruitt as Kentucky's 6th Commissioner of Education. Stephen comes to Kentucky with an extensive background in education at the local, state, and national levels. He started his education career as a high school chemistry teacher in Fayetteville and Tyrone, Georgia. He later served as the Science and Mathematics Program Manager and Director of Academic Standards with the Georgia Department of Education. Subsequently, he was named Associate State Superintendent for Assessment and Accountability, and ultimately Chief of Staff for the Georgia Department of Education.
Clearly, I couldn't keep the job.
Most recently, Stephen served as the Senior Vice President for Achieve Inc., where we also were fortunate to grab our own Corey Curl, a national nonpartisan nonprofit education reform organization based in Washington, D.C. During his tenure with Achieve, he coordinated the development of the next generation science standards. So with that, our conversation today is all about accountability. So a pillar of the committee's work now for over 30 years. And we've watched as our nation has gone through various iterations, and we in Kentucky have gone through various iterations of accountability. And so, Katie, I'd like to ask the first question of you, and that is, we know that last December Congress passed now the third reauthorization of our federal education law, and it's now called the Every Student Succeeds Act. Can you share a bit with us about the significance of the passage of that act and your work to support and help move that piece of legislation forward?
Sure. And I mostly favor quick responses, but if you'll bear with me, this actually takes a little bit longer because I think a little bit of history would probably be useful in helping you understand the place we're in. So the Federal Elementary and Secondary Act, the original one was passed as part of the War on Poverty in the mid-60s. And for about the first 3 decades of that law, the accountability of schools and districts and states in return for those federal dollars was all organized around proving that you spent the money only on the poor kids. So that was the initial form of accountability. By the mid-90s, it was pretty clear that that was having some perverse effects, because what it did was encourage schools to spend the money on things that they could prove they were spending the money for poor kids. So pull-out programs or projectors that sat in closets because they could only be used to show movies to the poor kids. And so in the mid-1990s, Congress reauthorized the law and made a big change around accountability. It said, essentially a new deal for the states. We're going to get off your back, or at least get more off your back in terms of proving how you spend the dollars, and ask you instead to show us achievement results for kids. You set the standards, you assess kids at least once per grade span, you define what kind of progress is good enough, but you got to make sure you disaggregate the results for poor kids and kids of color so we can see that progress is being made in return for these dollars. By the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, what happened, the effects of that were pretty clear. States set standards. They define progress pretty much as any old progress will do, thank you very much. And most of them didn't even disaggregate the data. The federal law required it, but they just didn't bother. And when you looked at the national data, state by state, what you found is that gaps between poor kids and non-poor kids and minority kids and white kids were actually growing during that period of time. So at this point, Congress said, this is not working. We've got to make sure we're really moving the achievement of low-income kids and kids of color because they're behind, and we got to close those gaps. So that's when they passed the No Child Left Behind law. And while now that law is reviled, I want to be clear that in its early days, it was widely celebrated. What it did was fundamentally redefine what it meant to be a good school in America. You could no longer be a good school if you just sent a few of your kids off to a fancy college. You couldn't be a good school if just average achievement was good, but the achievement of, say, black kids or Hispanic kids or students with disabilities was horrible. In order to be a good school, you had to be a good school for all groups of kids. Now, in the out years of that law, the kind of perverse effects of the very rigid federal definitions of not just what failure looked like, but what you had to do when a school was identified as needing improvement, that really began to feel. And so opposition to the law and to the test burden and to everything else started growing. Opposition essentially to this one-size-fits-all system. Had Congress done its job and reauthorized the law and fixed these problems, we probably would still be essentially on a more flexible version of that path. But they waited too long, until last year. And essentially by that time, the resistance to this prescribed federal approach was so strong that they essentially kicked the ball back to the states. So this new law, instead of sort of going halfway back, it basically says to states, you set the goals, you set the standards, you define what kind of progress is good enough, but it does have some important guardrails that are intended to make sure that states set bigger stretch goals for their low-income students, for their English learners, and so on, and act to make sure that schools that have consistent underperformance, either overall or for groups of kids, will actually do something about it. So, I mean, the real opportunity here, there's a big opportunity for states to actually show that they care not just about some kids, but about all kids, and design sort of what we would call accountability and improvement systems, because improvement is what it's all about, that actually speed us up instead of slowing us down. So that's the opportunity.
So Stephen, as you were coming into the state last fall, Congress was still working on the final passage of ESSA, passed in December. So then you knew that we would need to respond as a state, as the state of Kentucky, to this new legislation. But can you talk a little bit about your thinking as you were coming into Kentucky and your thoughts about whether or not now would be the right time to make the case for some new iteration of Kentucky's accountability system?
Sure. So, you know, I had the luxury of watching Kentucky from afar. You know, a lot of people think, and I found this to be true with a lot of Kentuckians, we don't realize the rich history we have, and we don't realize that we've actually done a lot already. So people kind of sometimes look at me funny, but you know, when I was in Georgia, we aspired to be Kentucky. I mean, we wanted to do a lot of the things that Kentucky was doing. And then I got a chance to watch it from a national level. And the unbridled learning system was one that was pretty well touted across the country. There was a lot of good things about it. But I think, like a lot of things, and I think Katie sort of already hit on this, you know, with accountability, and probably, I guess, with any education initiative, there comes that point where you start to get some diminishing returns. And for me personally, there's more to an achievement gap than just simply what the test score says. I had said this during my interviews with the board. You know, if you really want to talk about achievement gap, you need to talk about the root of why that gap exists, which is, in my opinion, an opportunity gap. So as I got here and started learning about this very complicated system, I mean, those of you who haven't dug into it very much, just ask somebody to explain it to you. And you know, I sort of always believe you should be able to explain it in the grocery store line. And our system, you pretty much had to be in the 15-item or less line behind 27 people who were all writing checks. I mean, you know, it was going to take a while. And so that was one thing that struck me immediately. The other thing that struck me was Kentucky, I think, had made an admirable attempt toward looking at opportunity through things like program reviews. But we were at a point where program reviews weren't really getting the job done. In fact, I think day one, somebody told me there was a problem with program reviews after they showed me where the bathroom was. Day two, they showed me how to sign things and then told me program reviews were a problem. And then day three, they showed me how to get to Lexington and said, oh, and by the way, program reviews are a problem. And so, while I think it was an admirable thing, I think we were at a point where we had to rethink it. And I think that with our current system, we never were getting past, and I hate to say it this way, but we really weren't getting past the autopsy that was the state test. To get into the root cause of that and looking at problems with preschool, kids not coming in ready in kindergarten. The fact that we have students that were, our students of color weren't having opportunities to take advanced coursework. And when I say advanced coursework, I mean everything from AP and IB to actually the second and third courses in a CTE pathway. Our gifted and talented students, we weren't really paying attention to them at all, and there's an opportunity gap with them as well. So to me, there was a lot that needed to be done or rethought. So we would have probably been moving forward with something different at this point. What ESSA allows us is a lot more flexibility on how we think about it and how to do it. What I'm not going to be willing to do is let Kentucky have a pass, because our number one issue is going to be equity. Our three pillars of the department are equity, achievement, integrity. And I can't have very much integrity if I continue to pretend that this achievement gap is just going to go away by itself.
And so that's a significant, worth significant mention, of course, that ESSA really does call states to task around the issue of equity. And while NCLB, Katie, to your point, really began to move us in a direction of thinking about all learners, ESSA has really called us to deepen our focus on equity. Katie, can you talk a little bit about the work that was happening at the